taxes, breaking all their promises. This is a crisis made in Downing Street. And, Mr. Speaker, it should hardly surprise the Chancellor that international markets are uneasy. The UK's long-term borrowing costs have risen to their highest in almost 30 years. But while the government was losing control of the economy, Mr. Speaker, where was the Chancellor? Her trip to China had not even begun when my urgent question was taken in the House last week. She was still in the country, but she sent the Chief Secretary rather than face up to her own failures. So can I ask the Right Honourable Lady why she chose not to respond herself? Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor, of course, ducked the difficult questions by jetting off to Beijing. I believe that in Labour circles they are calling it the Peking duck, Mr. Speaker. Well, whatever was on the menu in China, was it really worth the unedifying sight of an increasingly desperate politician scampering halfway around the world with a begging bowl? Was it really worth it? The Chancellor's deal pales in comparison to Labour's black hole, which has opened up in the public finances while the Right Honourable Lady was absent from her station. To give a sense of scale, Mr. Speaker, the deal the Chancellor has announced amounts to £120 million per year. The rise in our borrowing costs due to her disastrous budget has added around £12 billion to our annual spending on debt interest alone. Literally 100 times what she says she has brought back from Beijing. That is money that cannot now go on the public's priorities. £12 billion is enough to pay for 300,000 nurses, to cover Labour's pernicious winter fuel payments cut for 8.5 years. And of course, even before this latest market reaction, the budget meant spending tens of billions more in servicing our debt. According to the OBR forecast, 2/3 of the money raised from the Chancellor's jobs tax will be swallowed up by additional debt interest. Forget those billions going on better public services. They are going on paying the price of Labour's mismanagement. And we on this side know how this sorry story goes. We have seen it, Mr. Speaker. We have seen it all before. Socialist governments that think they can tax and spend their way to prosperity. Labour governments that simply do not understand that if you tax the living daylights out of business, you will get stagnation. They do not understand, Mr. Speaker, because there's barely a shred of business experience on the front bench opposite. And can I ask the Right Honourable Lady, which of her promises will she break if in March the OBR judge that she is now in breach of her own fiscal rules? Will she cancel promised spending? Will she ramp up borrowing? Or will she raise taxes yet again? Mr. Speaker, this whole sorry tale is nothing short of a Shakespearean tragedy, playing out before our eyes. This is the Hamlet of our time. They promised the electorate much while pouring the poison into their ear. At the end, you can feel the end. The Chancellor flailing, estranged it seems from those closest to her, those about her falling, the drums beating ever closer. To go or not to go, that is now a question. The Prime Minister will be damned if he does, but he will surely be damned if he does not. The British people deserve better.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Chancellor is simply not serious. I mean, occupied for 14 years. I think that usually when you have a statement, you ask some questions. Now, we heard a lot from the right honourable gentleman about what he wouldn't do. But we've heard absolutely nothing about what he would do. Now, you can now see what happens when the leader of the opposition tells the shadow cabinet they shouldn't have any policies. Because, as far as I can tell, the Conservative Party's economic strategy is to say that the UK should not engage with the second largest economy in the world, or indeed with our nearest neighbours and our biggest trading partners in the European Union. His economic strategy is to support higher spending, but none of the right decisions that are required to deliver sound public finances. And his economic strategy is to ignore the mistakes of the past, with no apology to the British people for his part in Liz Truss's mini-budget that crashed the economy. Now, I mentioned Liz Truss's mini-budget, but I appreciate that, having said that, I may now receive a cease and desist letter from her later. Now, the one question that the Shadow Chancellor did ask was, why did I go to China? Well, I went to secure tangible benefits for British businesses trading overseas. And the Shadow Chancellor said, well, it wasn't worth it. Well, you say that to HSBC, to Standard Chartered, Prudential, Schroders and the London Stock Exchange, who attended those meetings with me last week and have all said about the difference that it would make. Now, I have been under no illusion about the scale that we face. After 14 years of stagnant economic growth, higher debt and economic uncertainty. And we have seen global economic uncertainty play out in the last week. But leadership is not about ducking these challenges. It is about rising to them. The economic headwinds that we face are a reminder that we should, indeed we must, go further and faster in our plan to kickstart economic growth that plunged under the last government. By bringing stability to the public finances after years of instability under the party opposite, unlocking investment that plummeted under the previous government, and pushing ahead with the essential reforms to our economy and public services. That is my message to the House today. Because if we get it right, the prize on offer to us, to the British people, is immense. The opportunity to make working people off by making Britain better off. That is the mandate that this government has, and this is what we will deliver.
Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to growth in this country and to encourage investment in the UK. Listening, though, to the Shadow Chancellor, you'd think that the country was going to hell in a handcart. And doesn't she agree with me that there is no time for panic, that it is perfectly possible to manage any pressures on the budget through astute management of public spending, and that compared with the years of austerity on the last side, we are a very, very long way from that approach.
Chancellor.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that question. I set out the fiscal rules of this government at the budget in October, that we will pay for day-to-day spending through tax receipts and that we will get debt down as a share of the economy. We remain committed to those fiscal rules and we will meet them at all times.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Chancellor for advance sight of her statement. Let's be blunt. The budget hasn't worked. The Chancellor says that the government's #1 mission is growth, but to date there are no signs that the government is going to deliver it. The national insurance contributions rise is self-defeating. It undermines growth, it does not unleash it, and it piles pressure onto struggling small businesses and high streets. Neither does it raise anything like the sums of money for the NHS which the government initially suggested that it would. Now we have this much-lauded visit to China, but the government itself says that it is only worth £600 million to the UK over the next 5 years. This is equivalent to just 5.5 hours of NHS spending a year. That is 27.5 hours over the 5-year period. Mr. Speaker, all growth is welcome, but this really is small beer. And what, Mr Speaker, are we to make of the Chancellor's pledge to improve existing channels with China? This is nothing short of warm words and mixed messages. The Chancellor should not have gone to China unless there was a commitment that Jimmy Lai was going to be released. Does the Chancellor now accept that the national insurance increase will damage growth? Does the Chancellor accept that there were and still are much fairer ways to raise the necessary revenue without holding back our economy and our high streets? The international market jitters we have seen in the last few days are largely caused by the threat of tariffs by the new Trump administration. So will the Chancellor guard against the risks of a Trump presidency by rebuilding our trading relationship with our European neighbours? And after the economic vandalism of the previous Conservative government and their mini-budget, our NHS and care services are still on their knees. Does the Chancellor accept that wealth and health are two sides of the same coin, and that scaling back any investment in the NHS would not only be devastating for local communities, but also damaging for economic growth?
I'm slightly confused by the response from the Honourable Lady. They oppose every decision that we made to get the public finances under control at the budget, and now they say that we need to spend more on public services. Well, I'm afraid the Honourable Lady can't have it both ways. The only way that there's more money for our public services is by raising that, as we did in the budget, decisions that the Liberal Democrats apparently oppose. And then the Honourable Lady says that £600 million isn't worth it. Well, that's £600 million of tangible benefits for British businesses trading overseas. I would have thought that the Honourable Lady would welcome enhanced trade and investment as a way to create more good jobs, paying decent wages in St Albans and indeed in all of our constituencies. Now, the Honourable Lady says that we shouldn't go to China because we need to raise difficult issues. Well, I'm not sure how the Honourable Lady thinks we're going to raise difficult issues unless we engage with the second biggest economy in the world. And because I went to China, I was able to raise issues around human rights, around forced labour, around Hong Kong and Jimmy Lai, and around the sanctioning of parliamentarians. You can't raise those issues unless you were in the room. I was in the room and therefore able to do just that. And I would finally just say to the Honourable Lady, this is the party that put £20 billion into the National Health Service at the budget in October. We were able to do that because of difficult decisions that we took, including on taxation. The Honourable Lady seems to want the additional money for public services, but without finding any way to pay for them. Well, that is the way that the party opposite got into the troubles they got into. I'm afraid the Liberal Democrats are going down exactly the same path.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for raising the case of my constituent, Jimmy Lai? I know it will mean a lot to him and to his family. And does she agree with me that it is because of the profound differences that it is vital that we maintain this strategic engagement?
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for what she's just said, and I think on behalf of the whole House we would want to send our best wishes to the family of Jimmy Lai at this difficult time. I had the opportunity to raise this as well as other issues during my time in China, and I think it is incredibly important that at every opportunity that we have, we raise some of the difficult issues and challenge the Chinese authorities in the way that is appropriate and consistent with our British values.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the economic and financial dialogue was stayed because of the brutal imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. So when the Chancellor and the government now go back to engage and reopen that dialogue, she does so on the back that things have got worse, not better. And the reality I want to put to her is that while she was away, Cheyenne refused point blank in a select committee to answer the question whether they had slave labour in their supply chains, but the government wants them to register here in London. We have solar arrays being imported by the government here into the UK that demonstrably contain slave labour. So can I ask the Chancellor to be clear now to the House about the government's position on slave labour? Can she explain whether this government will allow any products or services or companies to align themselves here or import goods into here that contain any slave labour, no matter how important that import is.
Chancellor of the Exchequer. I thank the right honourable gentleman for that question, and I know how importantly he takes this issue, along with so many other members on both sides of the House. Listing of companies in the UK is a decision for the Financial Conduct Authority, but any company listing on the London Stock Exchange has to live up to the responsibilities set out by the United Nations and the OECD on issues of forced labour, and this government is committed to working with international partners and businesses to ensure that global supply chains are free from human and labour rights abuses. As the right honourable gentleman knows, under Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015, commercial businesses who operate in the UK and have a turnover of more than £36 million are required to report annually on the steps they have taken, and quite right so, because modern slavery is absolutely abhorrent and this government continues to take steps to deal with it.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, may I remind members opposite that UK bond yields are rising for the same reason German and French bond yields are, and that is because they are tracking the US rate. They never were very good at numbers, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor set out her economic philosophy that our prosperity is built upon secure foundations, indeed in a more uncertain world. Can the Chancellor set out how she is building that economic security here, and particularly with reference to having domestic energy rather than dependent on foreign fossil fuel dictators?
Chancellor of the Exchequer. I thank my honourable friend for that question, and he is absolutely right that economic growth has to be built on strong foundations, and that is the approach of this government. And indeed, our mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower is consistent with that, because if we can wean ourselves off fossil fuels and dictators for oil, then we will be more secure in our economy because we do not have to import so much from overseas.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's good to see the Chancellor back from China, and it's good to hear her reiterate that growth is her #1 mission, because we haven't had any growth since her budget. And I just would like to ask the Chancellor today, because accepting responsibility is the first step in solving a problem, will she accept that her budget last October has caused business confidence and growth prospects in this country's economy to plunge?
I thought for a moment that the honourable lady was going to apologise for Liz Truss's mini-budget, maybe on another opportunity.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for raising the case of Jimmy Lai. I hope the government will in future as well press on the case of pensions owed to BNO constituents of Early and Woodley across the UK who have moved here from Hong Kong. I was surprised to hear the Shadow Minister advocate the kind of knee-jerk responses to intraday movements in market prices. It's this kind of short-termism, I would argue, Madam Deputy Speaker, that has led the party opposite to have 5 chancellors in only 4 years. Can our Chancellor reassure us that she will not be misled by such short-termism and instead keep her focus on the long-term ambitions of our government to raise living standards and to raise growth?
Chancellor. The honourable lady, my honourable friend, is absolutely right. And there has been global movements in international markets in the last week or so, and those have been global in nature. But in the UK, we must do what we can, and that's why I've reiterated today my commitment to the fiscal rules that I set out in the budget in October, and reiterate that growth is the #1 mission of this government. Growth built on stability, which came through securing the public finances, through investment, including through the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, and reform of our pension system, our planning system to make it easier to build in Britain, getting people back to work and reforming our pension system. This government is cracking on after 14 years of failure from the party opposite.
Esther McVeigh.
Did the Communist Party of China tell the Chancellor she was doing a good job running the UK economy or a bad job running the UK economy when she was there?
I wasn't seeking assurance from any foreign government of the performance of this government. What I was seeking to do and what I achieved in China was getting tangible outputs for British businesses trading overseas, helping create more good jobs, paying decent wages here in Britain, something that the party opposite absolutely failed to do in 14 years.
Tim Rocker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Chancellor for her statement, and I particularly welcome the fact that she raised the issue of Jimmy Lai and human rights in Beijing. I think that's really, really important. After 14 years of inconsistency on China by the party opposite, does she agree with me that we need a cross-Whitehall strategy and a pragmatic approach?
Yeah. I think what is really important is that we take decisions in the national interest for Britain. And to take decisions in the national interest, that does mean engaging with our trading partners all around the world, which is why, since being appointed as Chancellor, I've been to Brussels to reset our relations with the European Union, as well as being in Washington and New York to welcome investment from overseas. And that's why I was in China, securing £600 million worth of benefits for UK businesses doing business in China.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer do what the Prime Minister refused to do yesterday and rule out future spending cuts?
Chancellor. I'm not going to write 5 years' worth of budgets in in the first 6 months of Labour government, but I'm absolutely committed to meeting the fiscal rules that I set out in the budget October, because we know what happens when governments lose control of the public finances, and that is they crash the economy and end up on that side of the House.
John Grady.
I'm obliged, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor may be able to learn a bit about emergency spending cuts from the Scottish Government in Holyrood, which has had 3 years of emergency spending budget cuts. Would the Chancellor agree with me that it's essential to engage with a large economy like China so that we can export our brilliant financial services sector and whisky from Scotland? And in the real world, we have to trade with large economies like China.
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for that question, and many of the benefits that we secured last week were for the financial services sector, and both Edinburgh and Glasgow are important hubs for financial services in the UK. Businesses like Aberdeen and Standard Chartered, who were on the delegation with me last week, have welcomed the tangible benefits that will result in more jobs and more economic prosperity for Scotland and across the United Kingdom.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It has been reported that whilst in China the Chancellor was going to meet the owners of British Steel. Many of my constituents work at the Scunthorpe Steelworks. Is she able, whilst I appreciate ministers may not have reached final decision on this, is she able to give any optimism to my, any reassurance to my constituents that she has had constructive engagement?
Chancellor. My right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, has met Mr Lee from Xingye on a number of occasions. Talks are ongoing, but I'm not able to provide an update on that today.
Preet Gill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor has only my admiration and support for the tough decisions she is taking to fix the fundamentals. And while this week's members opposite were carping about the Chancellor's whereabouts, she was having serious discussions with the world's second largest economy, securing access for UK firms. Isn't it clear that only one side of this House is serious about growth?
I will always stand up for Britain's national interest and Britain's economic interest, which is why I am helping British businesses, some of our best British businesses, to export around the world. That's what I'm doing, did in China at the weekend, and that is what I will continue to do, always standing up for our economic interest.
Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Has the Chancellor of the Exchequer spoken with the Governor of the Bank of England to talk about what action needs to be taken to bring about stability in our bond markets?
Chancellor.
Well, I regularly speak to the Governor of the Bank of England. Indeed, he was on the delegation to China with me this weekend, and we work closely together to ensure that the British economy remains competitive in global markets.
Katie White. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm quite surprised at the audaciousness of the benches opposite, who oversaw the debt levels rise over the last 14 years. It's just a shame they didn't turn their minds to it earlier. But does the Chancellor agree that serious discussions like these can deliver not just on our economic aims, but on our wider climate and international objectives? Chancellor.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. Unless we engage and work with our partners around the world, we're going to miss out on the opportunities that other countries secure for their businesses and their economies. And if we miss out on those investment opportunities and those trade opportunities, you can be sure that other countries will take advantage of them. That's why I was in China. That's why I will work with counterparts around the world to secure good outcomes for British businesses and jobs here in the United Kingdom.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor has been raising human rights abuses in China, but did she get the opportunity to raise with her interlocutors the extrajudicial work of the United Front Work Department, particularly in relation to UK institutions and especially universities?
Yes, good question.
Chancellor.
I raised a number of issues around human rights abuses, labour issues, and indeed rights and freedoms in Hong Kong, including the case of Jimmy Lai. I raised that with all of the ministers that I met in China, always standing up for our values and our interests.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unlike the party bickering on the opposition, we are cutting deals in the British national interest and putting Britain at the frontier. 600 million just over this weekend, an AI opportunities plan just this week. Hear, hear. Does the Chancellor agree with me that we are the party of action, they are the party of rhetoric?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. You know, we're on this side of the House and not going to apologise by getting a good deal for British businesses and people working for them. I'm determined to leave no stone unturned in ensuring that British businesses have the rights and the freedoms to export and trade around the world, helping to create good jobs here in Britain.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. UK exports to China currently represent less than 10% of UK total exports, whereas our exports to the EU represent over 40%, representing as it does the greater opportunities available to our small and medium enterprises in trading with the EU. Will the Chancellor commit to spending 4 times as much time talking to our European partners about our trading opportunities as she has done to China?
Chancellor. I would just say to the honourable lady, it's not either or. We can't write off one country and say we're going to put all our eggs in a different basket. China is our 4th biggest trading partner, and we can't miss out on opportunities for a country that is growing quickly with an expanding middle class, where there are huge export opportunities. But as the honourable lady knows, I was in Brussels in December to reset our relations, the first British Chancellor to go to a Eurogroup meeting since we left the European Union. So I'm leaving no stone unturned to exploit export opportunities for British businesses.
Callum Anderson.
And I thank the Chancellor for her statement. Can she set out in more detail how the government intends to help reinvigorate the UK-China Stock Connect so that UK companies and investors can access Chinese capital markets and vice versa?
Chancellor.
Stock Connect is an initiative first set up by former Conservative Chancellor Philip Hammond to improve links between the Shanghai and the London stock exchanges to help Chinese businesses access capital on UK financial markets. That's good for financial services firms operating in London, and the enhancement of that Stock Connect scheme at the weekend offers new opportunities for British businesses in financial services in the UK.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Chancellor flew east, the pound plummeted south and government debt rocketed north. Why? Because the markets don't believe her plan for growth. This is the fundamental issue. So I'd like to pick up the question from my honourable friend from behind me, is what is she going to say to the markets to make them believe she really does understand how to deliver growth in the UK?
Chancellor. There's been a global volatility in markets. I don't believe that it is reasonable to suggest that the reason why bond yields in the United States, in Germany and France have risen is because of decisions made by this government. I think the honourable member opposite should just get real.
Brian Leishman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thanks to the Chancellor for her statement. In regards raising money for public services, then an annual wealth tax on the multimillionaire and billionaire class would certainly achieve that. However, a conversation for another day. On to China. My right honourable friend and I have had previous discussions regarding the closure of the Grangemouth refinery, of which PetroChina, part of the Chinese state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation, is heavily involved in. If the refinery closes, then thousands of jobs will be lost. This is not just a constituency issue for me. It will impact all of Scotland, as our fuel and national security will be severely weakened. Did the Chancellor speak about the issue with her Chinese counterparts, and if not, will she do so?
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for that question. We're working closely with the Scottish Government to ensure that there's a bright future for the people of Grangemouth, because deindustrialisation should not be the future for communities, including in Scotland.
Richard Rice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the data shows, Chancellor, in September and October that the economy is falling. It's going down. And the markets are expressing their clear concerns, the currency markets, the bond markets, in selling off, that actually there is no growth and that the economy continues to fall. If the Chancellor is so confident, can she confirm to the House when the economy will start growing again?
Chancellor. I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. Growth is the #1 mission of this Labour government. But the truth is, it's not possible to turn things around quickly after 14 years of lacklustre growth and declining living standards from the party opposite. But we're leaving no stone unturned, which is why last week in China we secured £600 million worth of tangible benefits for the UK economy, helping great British businesses exporting overseas.
Nestle Calix-Scan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Chancellor agree with me that developing our economic and trading relationships with other nations is one of many important levers? And alongside that approach, public investment, planning reforms, and the absence under the Conservative government of industrial strategy, which was problematic, will be returned under this government so that we can see economic growth?
Chancellor. The best way to grow an economy is to boost investment in an economy. And the truth is, under the Conservatives, we were the only G7 economy where investment stood at less than 20% of GDP. That is the inheritance that this party was bequeathed by the party opposite. And we're beginning to turn that around by the creation of a national wealth fund to leverage in private sector investment, planning reform to get Britain building again, and pensions reform to unlock £80 billion of investment to help small and start-up businesses to grow. We're turning things around after 14 years of failure from the party opposite.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While the Chancellor was in China securing her measly £600 million, borrowing rates reached the highest that they have been since 2008. And in 2023, she said her budget would be a budget with real ambition to fix the foundations, a budget that would rebuild Britain. How's that going when her mess has caused the borrowing to be the highest it's been since 2008 and making real working people in this country suffer?
Chancellor. I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman follows global financial markets, but borrowing costs for countries around the world have increased. But what we saw under Liz Truss's mini-budget was something unique to the United Kingdom, where it was just UK markets affected because of the decisions by the party opposite.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's great to see our Chancellor of the Exchequer working with international business and winning investment for the UK. Yeah. Does she agree with me that whilst the party opposite were happy to sell out our heavy industry to China, leading to the end of steelmaking in Teesside after 150 years, our industrial strategy is delivering investment in steel, in chemicals and life sciences, in Stockton North, in Teesside and across the UK?
Chancellor.
The National Wealth Fund created by this government is to get investment into industries like carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, ports, and indeed in steel. And we were really pleased at the end of last year to be able to announce investment in carbon capture and storage in Merseyside and Teesside, securing billions of pounds of investment into those economies and securing many thousands of jobs.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Chancellor for her statement. I do think it's worth reminding the House that under the previous government, business investment fell to 28 out of 31 OECD countries, lower than Latvia, Slovenia and Hungary. Could the Chancellor set out how our industrial strategy is going to overcome this terrible legacy on business investment left by the party opposite?
Chancellor.
Well, one of the reasons for such poor investment and the lowest investment out of all the G7 economies is because our planning system makes it so hard to get anything done in this country. And that's why the planning and infrastructure bill that's being brought forward by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, will turn that around, making it easier to invest in transport, in digital, in housing and so much more. That is the way to get our economy growing after 14 years of failure.
Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Chancellor for her statement. China, New York, Washington, Toronto and Brussels to build economic relationships, yet won't take time to speak with the Ulster Farmers Union, the NFU, the Farmers Union of Wales, the NFU Scotland, to hear first-hand the devastating impact that her death tax is going to have on family farms and small businesses. When will the Chancellor realise no matter what deals she does around the world, and I welcome them, Rome is burning around her. Agriculture is the backbone of our economy, and therefore will she commit to meet with me on behalf of the thousands of farmers whose farms are going to be decimated by her death tax?
Chancellor. I've had the opportunity on a couple of occasions now to meet the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister from Northern Ireland, and I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, would be happy to meet with colleagues from Northern Ireland. But the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, we inherited a £22 billion black hole in the public finances from the party opposite, and to ensure that we can stabilise our public finances, we had to make difficult decisions on taxes. And at the moment, we hear from the party opposites they don't like the increases in taxes, but they want the increases in public spending. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't have it both ways.
Polly Billington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. Could she elaborate further how this visit and the discussions she has started are not just consistent with, but are a vital part of the government's approach to China? Cooperate where we can, compete where we need to, and challenge where we must.
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. This was the first economic and financial dialogue between our two countries since 2019, and since then other countries around the world have continued to engage with China, securing tangible benefits for their economies. I don't want UK businesses and people working in our country to miss out, and that's why this weekend we secured £600 million worth of tangible benefits for businesses exporting to China, therefore helping to create more good jobs, paying decent wages in our country.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm slightly worried that investors will be watching this statement and wonder what planet the Chancellor is on. She just said that she's investing in transport infrastructure. She's actually cutting transport capital budgets. She has previously said she wants only one budget a year, and the March statement is billed only as a fiscal forecast. Can she rule out any new tax rises or departmental spending cuts in the March budget, in the March statement, or will the fiscal forecast become an emergency budget?
Chancellor.
We've committed to have just one budget a year to provide businesses with the certainty that they need to invest. So we will have an update from the OBR in March. But I can also give this commitment. I set out, as I've already said, the fiscal rules that we will balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts, and we will get debt down as a share of GDP within the forecast period. And we will continue at all times to meet those fiscal rules.
Tony Vaughan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I congratulate the Chancellor on unlocking £1 billion of value for the UK economy, which would not have been unlocked if she hadn't gone to China.
Exactly.
Does she agree with me, though, that the government's decision to thaw UK-China relations, which was much needed, is reaping dividends now, and that while also allowing us to press China on difficult issues, including human rights and labour standards?
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for that question, and that's exactly right. We managed to secure tangible benefits for the UK economy and British businesses exporting. At the same time, we were able to make and raise difficult issues that we would not be able to raise if we weren't engaged. That's the benefits of being able to engage. You get the benefits and you can raise those tricky issues.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's beyond parody that His Majesty's Chancellor would go and throw herself at the mercy of the Chinese government and come back with £600 million over 5 years in revenue. Is she aware that £600 million in revenue is less than 1/90th of HSBC's annual profit? This is what she's holding up as a major achievement by the Treasury on their trade mission. But in answer to my right honourable friend from Aberdeen South, who very reasonably asked when, not if, when her fiscal rules are breached, which will she do? Increase borrowing, raise taxes or cut spending? Not over 5 years, this year.
Chancellor. Well, I'm sure that the honourable gentleman opposite is an expert in HSBC, but I would rather take the words of the chairman of HSBC, who welcomed the tangible investments and indeed led the financial forum that we also held last week in China. I've been really clear. We will meet our fiscal rules that I set out in the budget, and we will do that at all times, and that is the commitment that I made and a commitment that I continue to make.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Chancellor confirm that for her, growth must always go hand in hand with economic security, a lesson that the previous Conservative government refused to learn when they left 85% of us dependent on expensive foreign gas to heat our homes this winter?
Chancellor. I thank my honourable friend for that question. This government's clean energy mission will mean that we are less reliant on foreign dictators for our basic energy needs. That's why we're investing with carbon capture and storage, with floating offshore wind, and indeed getting rid of the absurd ban on onshore wind that the previous government brought in.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor referred to safeguarding national security in her statement, which I welcome, but this must include energy security. Yet her changes to the energy profits levy, removing investment allowances and not permitting new licences at a time when we are still reliant on oil and gas, not only undermines our energy security, but it is also dwarfing the £600 million that she has brought back from China with the £12 billion of tax revenues that will be lost from the sector. Why, rather than supporting our energy security, is the Chancellor turning her back on the sector, turning her back on these tax revenues and risking selling our energy security to China?
Chancellor.
Well, the Honourable Lady just has a brief look at the documents from the Office for Budget Responsibility. She will see that the changes to the Energy Profits Levy, taking up the tax rate from 75% to 78%, the same rate as it is in Norway, raises money. It doesn't lose it.
Yeah. Lindsay Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I commend the Chancellor for her visit to advocate for our country's best interests, but does she agree with me that Chinese companies must not provide any support to Putin's illegal war in Ukraine?
Chancellor. I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I raised such issues with my counterparts in China at the weekend. It's really important that whenever we engage with foreign governments, that we also raise issues consistent with our values, including Chinese companies supplying Russian government with materials that are used in Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Jim Allister.
Did the Chancellor raise any concerns, or indeed does she have any concerns, about the Confucius Institute, the Chinese government-backed operation across the United Kingdom? Did she raise any concerns about that? And in respect of Jimmy Lai, what answer did she get?
Chancellor.
When our Prime Minister met with President Xi Jinping in Rio last year, they agreed that one of the points of re-engagement was that we were able to make clear our concerns about a range of issues, but in a way that was private, and I'm not going to go into the details of that conversations, but with all of the Chinese officials that I met at the weekend, I raised these issues. And the problem is that the party opposite, for all their chuntering, they didn't raise these issues because they didn't even engage.
Ben Coleman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents in Chelsea and Fulham, many of whom work in financial services, will have been amazed, I think, just as I was now, when the Shadow Chancellor, in a fit of pique, demanded that the Chancellor should have come home from China to talk to him in this House, rather than stay, rather than promote growth, access to the world's second largest market, and winning new licences, winning quota allocations for financial services businesses, with, as anybody who's taken the trouble to listen carefully to the Chancellor will have recognised, more on the way. So what does the Chancellor think the City and the banks that accompanied her would have preferred in the long-term interests of this country? Stay in China to win for this country, or come home to satisfy the Shadow Chancellor's fit of pique?
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, you just have to look at what the businesses have already said about the deal that we managed to secure last week. Tangible benefits for British businesses exporting to China, helping to create more good jobs, paying decent wages here in Britain. It's been welcomed by businesses. It's a shame that the party opposite no longer stands up for British businesses.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have an embargo on Russian oil and gas. China continues to import it, and apparently Russia will be China's #1 supplier this year. Did she raise this with her counterparts on her trip to China? And what assessment has she made of her deal so that it doesn't inadvertently support the Russian war effort?
Chancellor.
As I've already said in the House today, I raised the issue about Chinese companies supplying the Russian government. I raised those issues. And indeed, the honourable member will know that last week, alongside the United States, we increased sanctions on Russian oil and gas to make it harder for Putin to continue to conduct his illegal war.
Chris Vince.
Deputy Speaker, can the Chancellor outline how this visit is an example of ongoing dialogue with the international community which will benefit businesses and residents in my constituency of Harlow? And while we're quoting Shakespeare, will she agree with me that there's something rotten in the state of the Conservative Party? or perhaps the Conservative Party is in a rotten state?
Chancellor.
I'm glad that my honourable friend has used the 50 minutes of this statement to come up with such a good line. Look, my honourable friend is absolutely right that many people working in Harlow work in the financial services sector and will very much welcome the enhanced licences and quotas and licences, incidentally, that many other countries and their banks already have because their governments have engaged with China. Those are opportunities that we've missed out on in Britain for far too long because for 6 years we failed to be involved in an economic and financial dialogue whilst other governments cracked on and made sure that they supported and stood up for their national interest.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Notwithstanding the importance of China as a trading partner, can the Chancellor please explain to the House what steps the government is taking to address the issues of forced labour links with Uyghur workers in supply chains and fast fashion companies like Shein? Can the Minister provide data on the extent of forced labour in UK supply chains, especially in the garment sector, and outline any actions to strengthen due diligence requirements for companies sourcing from known human rights abuse areas like Xinjiang?
Chancellor.
Look, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As I've already set out, one of the issues that I was able to raise with my counterparts in China was issues around forced labour, particularly in Xinjiang. And as I said in answer to the question from the right honourable gentleman, the member for Chingford and Wood Green, I also have been really clear that any company seeking to list in London has to meet stringent requirements as set out by the United Nations and the OECD on labour supply and the treatment of workers.
Final question in this statement, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Whilst I welcome the UK-China Economic and Financial Dialogue Agreement, however, as Chair, and the Chancellor will know this, however, as Chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, I have repeatedly in this House highlighted human rights abuses in China, with the Uyghur Muslims, with Tibetan Buddhists, with Christians in Hong Kong and China. How will the Government and the Chancellor ensure safeguards to British money and goods are put in place to ensure that economic engagements do not directly support these violations? Human rights concerns, forced labour, denial of religious freedom, ongoing suppression in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong and Taiwan must be remembered at all costs in all deals with China. Thank you.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that thoughtful question. It's important that when we engage with China that we cooperate where we can compete where necessary, but that we challenge whenever our values do not align. Like the honourable gentleman, I care deeply about issues of religious freedom and also about issues of forced labour. But that's the whole point about engaging, because you have to engage in the world as it is, not as the world as we would like it to be. And it is through these engagements that we are able to raise even some of the most difficult of issues and be very clear about the values of our great country.
That concludes the statement, and I'll now give a few moments for the front benches to swap over. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. 10-minute rule motion. Joe Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to conduct a review of the contribution of community energy to the Government's 2030 Clean Power Mission. The Green Power Mission and climate policy more generally is what brought me into politics. Ensuring that we have a world that is economically, ecologically and environmentally viable for future generations is one of the reasons that I'm privileged to stand in this House today and one of the reasons that many people across the constituency put their faith in me. I want to thank local climate groups such as the Hexham Climate Cafe, the North Tyne Climate Action Group and Sustainable Haltwhistle for their engagement and their feedback on climate issues. I'm always committed to working with local charities and organisations throughout my constituency as we work to protect our climate and our planet. I also want to pay tribute to the Cooperative Party for their constant raising this issue on a national level. The country is on a vital mission to achieve net zero and to combat the immediate and very real threat of climate change. It's a mission that we can and must achieve. The British people deserve lower costs, secure power, with good jobs and a government that protects them from the long-term threats posed by climate change. I'm glad that this government has committed to a clean power mission by 2030 that will achieve energy security, protect bill payers, create good jobs and help to protect future generations from the cost of climate breakdown. To ensure that this country is on the right path to becoming a clean energy superpower, it's essential that we unlock the full extent of renewable energy and conduct a necessary review of the contribution of community energy to that 2030 clean power mission. For decades, energy has been produced and crucially owned far away from this country. Many constituents will pay their energy bills to a company based 600 miles in an ocean away. We know our energy system is broken, but for too long it's been too distant to fix. The Labour government will do things differently. Great British Energy, owned by the British people, will invest in clean energy and ensure that our communities reap the benefits, not just through cheaper bills that families can afford, but also through new jobs for our young people, bringing growth that will revitalise local economies. The local power plan to be developed by Great British Energy has the potential to facilitate that necessary drive towards community energy projects, ensuring funding is available to support local projects that could be transformational. Community energy offers a crucial opportunity of agency and empowerment within local communities to develop practical and long-term energy solutions. Not only will it deliver key elements essential for reaching our net zero targets, but it will encourage a local generation at household and community level, reducing the need for electricity to be imported into communities. How individual houses change their energy usage is necessary for making our net zero targets achievable. There are opportunities for community-owned power throughout the country. We know what can happen when communities as a whole come together. We see the mutual support and care that constituents hold for another. When a community, like many in the North East, have been left behind time and time again, we know how to pull together. Community energy and community engagement are essential for achieving that net zero transition. Individual households throughout the country can engage through both centralised generation and storage. Houses can be powered locally, reducing demand for imports from the distribution network and cutting energy bills. Now, as a leader in offshore wind power and research, the North East is already a front runner in energy production. Already supporting over 5 gigawatt of offshore production, the North East has a further 72 gigawatt of potential production. My region can display leadership not only in production, but also through infrastructure. We can supply more than 130 gigawatt of offshore power through the North East local supply chain across all 4 of our nations. Now, supporting the green energy transition can start in the North East. Not only is the region strongly placed to deliver the offshore wind in the North Sea, but we're also in a strong position to install and maintain the growing pipeline of heat network projects that would support the supply chain in the North East, foster highly skilled jobs that are vital for the region and necessary for ensuring that young people in the North East can remain in the North East to secure high-paying, highly skilled work. It's essential that the resources the country has at its disposal are properly recognised. Through community engagement and energy, effective solutions can be tailored specifically to regions and localities. Community-owned energy projects are, however, not new. They already exist and thrive across the country, thanks to the innovation and drive of individuals. I want to acknowledge and highlight the phenomenal work of Humsoft Net Zero, its founder Herbie Newell and David Still, both for their support and for their commitment to delivering net zero emissions by 2030. One of the first meetings I had as Hexham's MP was in the room above the Crown pub in Humsoft to talk about net zero, which I'd highly recommend to the Minister if he comes up to visit. Humsoft Net Zero have already installed a number of low-carbon technologies, including solar, heat pumps, battery storage, electric vehicles and biomass. Their efforts to launch this year one of the first community-based solar farms in the North East captures the community spirit and drive of the constituents. Their aim is to successfully deliver half of the electricity demand of the parish. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe the work of Humsoft Net Zero would be of valuable interest to the review community energy, informing how to unlock community energy at scale and how to support the development of other projects throughout the region and the country. Provides a strong example of community engagement and a model for how this can be achieved. Launching a review will assist the Secretary of State to understand how best to support the thriving community energy schemes that already exist, as well as set up new projects that benefit new communities. A review could consider how to expand the availability of funding for local projects. A review can examine how best to support community energy projects, specifically those in rural areas, to facilitate strong working relations with landlords and ensure planning processes receive local support and consultation. Supply companies can be mandated to ensure that economic power is contractually negotiated on economic terms. A review can also identify how best to successfully expand and transform smaller projects into large-scale projects that respect local communities and interests. Smaller community projects face far higher financial challenges. The possible guarantee scheme could make considerable headway to successfully minimising the risk. Through conducting a review, solutions can be considered to tackle 2 major challenges for community energy projects: ensuring funding is available on competitive terms and that there is support for electricity to be sold to the community to maximise project revenue. Launching this vital review into community energy will support our mission to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. Now, throughout the Hexham constituency, I'm proud that local residents are already engaging in efforts to reduce their emissions and to commit to green energy and achieve that 2030 mission. In Prado, the work of Friends of Eastwoods Park and the Miners' Lamp Cafe has introduced solar panels and battery storage. This has received vital funding from Northern Power Grid, and through that, through the drive of local residents, they've made sure the building can still be heated, that meals can be cooked and ingredients can be preserved through the local green energy supply. The Stocksfield Community Association has, similarly, transformed the local community centre into a crisis centre. Achieving a self-sufficient energy source, the community centre can operate as a support service for local residents during emergencies. Not only is this a valuable asset to the local community, it offers a cost-effective solution. Now, as Prado, Humsoft and Stocksfield represent, community energy provide more than just energy. They foster community collaboration and cohesion. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clear that we need to take community power seriously. Community energy is integral to our clean power mission. It is integral to ensuring that cheap and affordable power is accessible to local residents across the country, and it's essential for ensuring that the country utilises our valuable resources at our disposal. Conducting a review of the contribution of community energy to the 2030 Clean Power Mission is vital for identifying challenges, threats and the necessary solutions. I look forward to a future where my home and the homes of my constituents can be powered by green energy built and generated in the North East. Thank you.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Emma Foodie, Mark Ferguson, Polly Billington, Maya Ellis, James Naish, Torquil Crichton, Simon Ofer and myself.
Joe Morris.
Community Energy Review Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 11th of July 2025.
Friday the 11th of July 2025. I'll just give a few moments for the front benches to swap over. We'll now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Renters' Rights Bill as amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
No.
We will begin with Government New Clause 13, with which it will be convenient to consider other new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call the Minister to move New Clause 13. Minister Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to bring this important bill back to the House this afternoon. Let me begin by thanking honourable members on both sides of the chamber for their engagement with it over recent months. In particular, I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister, the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and other members of the committee for the diligent and thoughtful line-by-line scrutiny of the bill they undertook over the course of many sittings late last year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this Labour government promised to succeed where its predecessor had failed by quickly and decisively acting to transform the experience of private renting in England. Today we make further tangible progress toward delivering on that commitment. Our Renters' Rights Bill will modernise the regulation of our country's insecure and unjust private rented sector, levelling decisively the playing field between landlord and tenant. It will empower renters by providing them with greater security, rights and protections so they can stay in their homes for longer, build lives in their communities and avoid the risk of homelessness. It will ensure we can drive up the quality of privately rented housing so that renters have access to good quality and safe homes as a matter of course. And it will allow us to crack down on the minority of unscrupulous landlords who exploit, mistreat or discriminate against renters. The bill will also provide tangible benefits for responsible landlords who provide high-quality homes and a good service to their tenants. Not only will its provisions see the reputation of the sector as a whole improve, as those landlords whose behaviour currently tarnishes it are clamped down upon, but the bill will also ensure that good landlords enjoy simpler regulation and clear and expanded possession grounds so they can regain their properties quickly when necessary. Madam Deputy Speaker, while we've eschewed the previous government's habit of shoehorning swathes of new clauses into legislation following second reading, we did need to make a modest number of improvements to the bill in committee. Many of the amendments in question were minor and technical or consequential in nature, but I'll briefly explain to the House some of the more substantive changes that were made. To increase fairness for tenants being evicted because their landlord is at fault, we chose to make an amendment connected to ground 6A. As honourable members will be aware, this mandatory ground allows landlords to remove their tenants when eviction is necessary for them to comply, not only with enforcement action, but as a result of separate changes we made to the bill, with planning enforcement action as well. The amendment made allows the court to require landlords to pay compensation to the tenant when they're forced to vacate their homes under such circumstances. to provide greater flexibility for social landlords in meeting the demands of local housing markets. We widened ground 1B for rent-to-buy tenancies, ensuring registered providers can take possession in all necessary circumstances. We also exempted assured tenancies from the 90-day rule, which protects housing supply in London and benefits permanent residents by preventing the conversion of family homes into short-term lets. Should a tenant give notice early in their tenancy, meaning they leave before 90 consecutive nights have passed, these changes mean the landlord will not automatically be found to have inadvertently provided temporary sleeping accommodation. Lastly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we made changes to ensure the introduction of a decent home standard in the private rented sector works as intended. These changes guarantee... I will give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. Last week I asked the Government to ensure that all service family accommodation meets the minimum standards of social housing as set out in the Decent Home Standard. The Minister for Veterans confirmed that you already do this. Will the Government therefore be supportive of amending the Renters' Right Bill to officially extend the Decent Home Standard to the Ministry of Defence service family accommodation?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I agree with the objective she has in mind. But as we discussed fairly extensively in committee, we don't think the Renters' Rights Bill and the way the Decent Homes Standard will apply to assured tenancies in this sector is right for MOD accommodation, though the MOD are undertaking their own review, and I'll touch upon that specific issue later in the debate. As I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, these changes around the Decent Home Standard will guarantee that the appropriate person can always be subject to enforcement action, and they close a potential gap that may have been exploited by clarifying the types of accommodation that will be required to meet the standard. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are proposing a small number of further improvements, most of which are again minor and technical in nature, and I will now turn to them. As I've made clear repeatedly throughout the passage of the bill today, this Government has long recognised that demands for extortionate amounts of rent in advance put undue financial strain on tenants and can exclude certain groups from renting altogether. I'm sure many of us in the chamber today will have heard powerful stories from our constituents about the impact of such demands. The typical story is all too familiar. Tenants find and view a property that, as advertised, matches their budget, only to find that on application they're suddenly asked to pay several months' rent up front to secure it. Tenants in such circumstances often confront an almost impossible choice. Do they find a way to make a large rent in advance payment, thereby potentially stretching their finances to breaking point, or do they walk away and potentially risk homelessness if they are unable to find an alternative?
Would the Minister give way on that point?
I will give up.
I thank Minister for giving way, and I thank him for the work he's been doing on this. He's highlighted the issue of tenants being asked to pay up front. In my constituency and many other London constituencies, that upfront cost amounts to a deposit in some cases to purchase a home. Does the Minister agree that we need to look into that, and also the practice where estate agents are effectively getting tenants to bid against other tenants for private rented accommodation? Minister.
Well, my honourable friend and the chair of the Select Committee is absolutely right, and as I'll just go on to detail, that is precisely why the Government are moving to prohibit this practice. The Government, as she will know, has already moved to ban bidding wars through the bill, where often desperate tenants are pitted against each other so that a landlord is able to extract the highest possible rental payment they can. Demands for large rent in advance payments, which is absolutely right, in many parts of the country can amount to 6, 9, even 12 months of rent in advance, can clearly have a similar effect, with tenants encouraged to offer ever larger sums up front to outdo the competition and secure a home that may or may not be of a good standard or risk being locked out of renting altogether. As I have stated previously, it might be argued that the interaction of the new rent periods in Clause 1 of the bill, which cannot be longer than a month, and the existing provisions of the Tenant Fees Act 2019 relating to prohibited payments, provide a measure of protection against requests for large amounts of advance rent. I will give way in just a second. However, I made clear during committee stage that there is a strong case for putting this matter beyond doubt, and that's what we intend to do.
I thank the Minister for giving way. As the Minister will know, before coming to this place, I worked for a homeless charity in Harlow called Streets Homes, and part of our role was to support homeless people, both rough sleepers and the hidden homeless, to get into rented accommodation. And often we provided the deposit for that. So would he agree with me that actually this legislation will actually help charities like Streets Homes provide more support to more people that are in need?
Minister.
It absolutely will, and I'll go on to detail some of the other changes we're making to ensure that the bill achieves the objectives that we have set out. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I was saying, having listened to the concerns raised by numerous stakeholders, the views expressed at second reading and in committee, and the representations made to me by individual honourable members, including my honourable friends, the members for Darlington, Sheffield Central and Leeds Central and Headingley, we've therefore tabled new clauses 13 and 14. New clause 14 would limit the amount of rent that a landlord can require to a maximum of 1 month. It would prevent unscrupulous landlords from using rent in advance to either set tenants against each other in de facto bidding wars or exclude altogether certain types of renters who are otherwise perfectly able to afford the monthly rent on a property. It does so by amending Schedule 1 to the Tenant Fees Act 2019 so that any payment of rent made before a tenancy agreement is signed will be a prohibited payment. If a landlord or letting agent invites, encourages or accepts such a payment, they could face local authority enforcement action and a fine of up to £5,000. New clause 13 would amend the Housing Act 1988 to ensure tenants continue to be protected from unreasonable requests for rent to be paid early once a tenancy has commenced. Landlords would no longer be able to include any terms in the tenancy agreement that have the effect of requiring rent to be paid prior to the rent due date. Tenants would retain the flexibility to make payments of rent in advance within a tenancy agreement should they wish to do so. The effect of these amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, would be that tenants can be certain that the financial outlay to secure a tenancy will not exceed the cost of a tenancy deposit and the first month's rent, and that they will not be required to pay their rent earlier than agreed. It would thereby reduce the barriers that stop tenants moving from substandard or insecure housing, and I commend it to the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, those honourable members with large student populations will know the dynamics of the general student rental market in many parts of the country see students compelled to make important decisions about accommodation long before they have formed stable friendship groups or have had time to properly judge a property's condition or location, and to consequently pay substantial deposits at a point in time when they are already coping with significant additional costs. This arms race, in which students are pressured ever earlier in the year to enter into contracts for the subsequent academic year, is clearly not benefiting them, and it's arguable as to whether it's benefiting student landlords who are engaged in it. The Government has therefore tabled Amendments 18 and 53. These would prevent the use of Possession Ground 4A in instances where a student tenancy was agreed more than 6 months in advance of the date of occupation, thereby helping to reduce the prevalence of this practice. I want to be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the amendment would not lead to an outright ban on contracts being agreed more than 6 months in advance. Instead, making the use of Ground 4A conditional on not doing so will act as a strong disincentive against landlords who wish to use it, pressuring students into early sign-ups, as many do now. I'd like to thank all those who've advocated for this change, including the former member for Sheffield Central, Paul Blomfield, during his time in Parliament, my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, and organisations including Unipol. Madam Deputy Speaker, having taken up the cause of a family in her constituency who were forced by a letting agent to continue to pay as guarantors for a property that had been rented by their son before he tragically took his own life, my honourable friend, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, has been campaigning for many years to protect bereaved families by prohibiting this practice. I pay tribute to her for her tireless efforts to secure change in this area. She was unable to persuade the previous government to make the necessary changes to the Renters Reform Bill. But this government are determined to act to end the abhorrent practice where guarantors are held liable for unpaid rent owed solely as a result of the death of a tenant who's a family member. We've therefore tabled new clause 15. This amendment will limit the liability of a guarantor of a tenancy agreement for rent in circumstances where a tenant has died. I should make clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, if in a joint tenancy the guarantor is not a family member, their liability for rent will be maintained. We consider this fair because we do not think it is reasonable to remove the guarantor's liability and therefore expose a landlord to additional financial risk where the guarantor is not related to the deceased. We think our new clause 15 strikes the right balance. Guarantors will be protected from being held liable for rent when they are grieving. Landlords will be able to reclaim costs owed prior to a tenant's death. Guarantors' liability for other costs incurred under the tenancy will not be affected. I turn now to Amendments 40 and 41, which would amend existing powers to charge fees for the PRS database. The amendment would expand the definition of relevant costs which can be considered when calculating such fees, and would enable fee revenue to include PRS enforcement costs incurred by local housing authorities. Honourable members should be assured that database fees will be calculated and agreed at a later date, with further details set out in secondary legislation, and developed on the basis that fees must be reasonable and proportionate. These amendments do not alter that position. In setting the fees, a range of factors will be considered, including the costs incurred by landlords. However, we do need to ensure that when calculating fees, we can take into account all relevant costs, and this amendment will ensure that is the case. Enabling fee revenue to include PRS enforcement costs is also important. For these reforms to have the impact we all want, effective enforcement will be crucial, and this was a point that was debated at some length during committee stage. As we've touched upon frequently throughout our consideration of the bill today, local housing authority capacity and resourcing is a real problem. This amendment provides an additional lever to help make sure that every local housing authority has the tools and resources it needs to carry out its enforcement role, so that good tenants and good landlords benefit from a well-regulated and enforced PRS. Turning next to Amendments 35 to 39, these expand the scope of what can be covered by the compulsory fee that private landlords will be required to pay to fund the new PRS Landlord Ombudsman. They would ensure that the fee can cover the set-up costs of the Ombudsman and activities specified in the regulations beyond those strictly necessary for mandatory aspects of landlord redress. This will allow the Ombudsman to set up the core redress service and to potentially provide additional member benefits, such as landlord-initiated mediation or voluntary member redress, without the costs having to be borne by the taxpayer. Turning next to Amendments 42 to 52, Madam Deputy Speaker, rent repayment orders are an important and effective tenant-led enforcement tool. They deter landlords from non-compliance and empower tenants to take action against unscrupulous landlords. This bill will significantly strengthen rent repayment orders, including their extension to superior landlords in rent-to-rent arrangements. But we intend to go further and ensure these sorts of arrangements cannot be used to evade responsibility and escape enforcement action. We're also making it clear that tenants and local authorities can seek a rent repayment order against any landlord in the chain, regardless of who they paid the rent to. Turning next to Amendments 24 and 26, which limit the circumstances in which landlords can use Ground 7 to obtain possession from a person who has inherited a tenancy following the death of a tenant. These amendments will provide greater security for bereaved tenants by preventing them from losing their home. And I want to acknowledge the role that Marie Curie have played in advocating for change in respect of this matter. Landlords will still be able to use Ground 7 if the original tenant had inherited it by will or intestacy, or the inheriting individual didn't live in the property before the tenant passed away. Landlords will also be able to use Ground 7 for specialist tenancies, such as supported and temporary accommodation. This is in recognition of the critical role such tenancies play in supplying housing to those with specialist needs. Madam Deputy Speaker, private registered providers are currently restricted from using the possession ground for redevelopment, Ground 6, apart from where they have a superior landlord who wants to redevelop the property. Other possession grounds, such as the suitable alternative accommodation ground, Ground 9, can be used to move tenants, but only if clear conditions are met. Whilst we expect PRPs to work closely with tenants to facilitate moves to enable redevelopment work, the government accepts that in limited cases it can be increasingly hard to meet these conditions, preventing PRPs from progressing with crucial redevelopment work. I thank the National Housing Federation for raising concerns about this matter with me. I will give way.
Mr. giving way on this point, and I welcome what he's just said. Is he aware that there seems to be quite a lot of landlords at the present time who are using unreasonable arguments in order to terminate tenancies or raise rents ahead of this legislation coming in? And is there anything that he or his department can do to protect tenants during this quite stressful period for them?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. There is a lot of bad practice out there. That's the very reason why the government have acted so quickly to ensure these reforms are introduced, and we're confident these reforms, once in place, will provide tenants with the protection they deserve. In the interim, I'm afraid there will continue to be bad practice of the kind this bill will stamp out. Madam Deputy Speaker, for the reasons I've just alluded to, we've tabled Amendments 19 and 22 to give private registered providers an alternative route to obtain possession for redevelopment and for decant accommodation. Where the landlord seeks possession on Ground 6 or 6ZA because they intend to carry out redevelopment work or want to move a tenant on from decant accommodation, they will need to provide alternative accommodation that meets specific requirements. This includes the accommodation being affordable, in a suitable location and not overcrowded. The accommodation must also be let as an assured tenancy or equivalent, unless being let for a temporary period pending the tenant being moved to an assured tenancy or equivalent. To use Ground 6ZA, landlords must give tenants prior notice to ensure they are fully aware the accommodation is provided for temporary decant use. If the landlord does not do this, they are liable for a fine of up to £7,000. Where landlords wish to accommodate tenants temporarily in properties that are earmarked for redevelopment, social landlords must give prior notice and set out the intention to redevelop the accommodation and the timeframe for redevelopment in the written statement. Under these circumstances, alternative accommodation will not need to be provided. Social landlords will also be required to pay removal expenses for social tenants when using Ground 6 and Ground 6ZA. We expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, the need to use Ground 6 and Ground 6ZA will not arise often in practice through PRP's engagement with tenants, but where needed, these amendments will ensure that significant redevelopment work is not unduly delayed. Government Amendments 12, 13, 17, 20, 21, 23, 28, 29, 30 and 54 are related and consequential provisions to reflect the new ability for landlords to gain possession for redevelopment and for decant accommodation. We think this group of amendments gets the balance right, enabling PRPs to progress redevelopment and use temporary decant accommodation during redevelopment works, while ensuring tenants are provided with appropriate alternative accommodation and removal expenses. Turning finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, to Amendment 34. Clause 30, as drafted, ensures long leases can continue to function by excluding leases over 7 years from the assured regime. These leases are typically used in purchases of leasehold and shared ownership properties. I'm grateful to stakeholders for raising concerns about the possibility of some unscrupulous landlords using Clause 30 to circumnavigate the new assured regime. Those that fit that description could potentially do this by issuing leases over 7 years with a break or early termination clause that is operable in the first few years. Tenants must not be cheated out of the assured tenancy regime's protections. Government Amendment 34 will therefore exclude all leases over 21 years from the assured regime. This will act as a much stronger deterrent to landlords who seek to avoid the assured tenancy regime. The amendment also excludes existing leases between 7 and 21 years to ensure they can continue to operate as they are currently intended to. It also ensures that regulated home purchase plans can continue to enable consumers to purchase property using the principles of Islamic finance, by adding them to the list of excluded tenancies in Schedule 1 to the Housing Act 1988. Madam Deputy Speaker, in closing, the amendments the Government have tabled for consideration today are a series of targeted changes designed to ensure that the bill works as intended. I commend them all to the House. I conclude by thanking honourable members for their efforts to improve the bill and for the scrutiny and challenge it has received so far, and I look forward to listening to the remainder of the debate this afternoon.
Prohibition of rent in advance after lease entered into, except initial rent.
The question is that new Clause 13 be read a second time. Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I echo the Minister's comments in opening, and in particular extend my thanks both to the Minister and his team, to the other members who served on the committee, and to the many witnesses who came in to share their views as this bill went through its committee stages. It's clear that a lot of the debate has taken place around the real-world impact that this legislation will have, rather than on some of the political points which also exist within this debate. And certainly in that spirit, I'll be setting out my responses and the rationale behind a number of the amendments that we've made, which will be falling to votes and debates during the course of this afternoon. Now, clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, legislation is about striking the right balance. And in our contribution to the debate, in our previous attempts at legislation, and in our contribution this afternoon, we'll be looking to recognise the impact that this bill will have on tenants, on landlords, and on those particular stakeholders in this system who our amendments have sought to protect. And I highlight in particular the impact on students, on financially vulnerable tenants, such as those with poor credit scores, tenants who have pets, small landlords who are themselves vulnerable to financial shocks, and of course those other groups, some of whom have been touched on and I'm sure will be covered later on, agricultural workers, military families, those who have work-related accommodations such as NHS workers and military families, and school staff, all of which have been touched on during the debate in the committee stages. All of our amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, have sought to address some of these practical issues. For example, ensuring in the real world that when work is required to be done to a property and a tenant may be reluctant to allow the landlord in to carry out that work for whatever reason, that there is sufficient freedom and flexibility in the legislation that that can take place.
On that point,
of course.
I
Thank you to the Shadow Minister for giving way. He talks about situations where tenants have to leave the property. A constituent of mine had a terrible ordeal where she had moved into a new rental property, but after 3 months it became uninhabitable, and she spent a further 11 weeks going in and out of 8 Airbnbs. She was left thousands of pounds out of pocket because the landlord's insurance covered him for the loss of rent, but didn't cover the accommodation costs that she had to incur as a tenant. I wonder whether the Shadow Minister would be supportive of my new clause 22, which would require that landlords hold appropriate insurance for the purposes of paying any costs related to alternative accommodation in these situations.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Clearly, there are a number of ways in which the issue which the honourable member has highlighted can be addressed. I know the Minister has talked about compensation. We've had our own amendments in respect of insurance, but clearly there needs to be a very effective dispute resolution mechanism in place so that when those kind of situations arise, it can be resolved. But in particular, we were focused on a situation where, for example, work to improve energy efficiency, to ensure that health and safety concerns in a property such as mould were addressed, and a tenant needed to leave because the extent of that works would render the property uninhabitable, that there was sufficient flexibility to address that. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst there have been very substantial areas of agreement on the bill, much of which does take forward work which started under the previous government as the Renters Reform Bill, we do have concerns that the new bill in the version before us creates significant new concerns around the availability and the affordability of accommodation in the private rented sector, a sector which we must not forget enjoys the highest tenant satisfaction of any type of tenure. 82% of private renters say that they are satisfied with their accommodation. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we know the current backdrop is challenging, and it's become a lot more so recently. The Chancellor's budget has set inflation rising, and borrowing costs, we know, are soaring. Markets are responding to the chaos in number 11, and that's creating a great deal of uncertainty, both for tenants and landlords alike. The Chancellor's decisions are stoking inflation, and that's pushing rent and housing costs of all kinds up. And the black hole in local government funding that was unveiled just before Christmas means that councils facing these twin existential threats of wholesale reorganisation and growing funding shortfalls lack certainty from the government about the funding to deliver this enormous increase in their workload. Of course.
The Shadow Minister, and I know that this is an area that he does care passionately about, especially with his local government experience. Does he agree with me that where we've seen many families facing eviction, the financial pressures and costs that local authorities have to pick up in temporary accommodation is adding to this, and hence why we should have abolished Section 21 no fault eviction soon?
Shadow Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd say gently to the Honourable Lady, had Labour Lambeth Council not recently rushed to put 200 of its own people on the streets using Section 21 because they are concerned about the impact that this bill will have on their housing situation, it would have more credibility. It is very clear that this is a difficult situation in all parts of the country. There is a significant shortfall and a rising cost attached in particular to emergency accommodation in London. Just as we know in other parts of the country, there are areas with a surplus of accommodation. And all of that is part of a very complex picture that we need to make sure works efficiently and effectively together. And it is absolutely right that we set out our concerns about whether this bill in all areas goes far enough or in some cases too far towards addressing those. So I was touching on the black hole in local government funding and the impact that that has. Another area which we know is driving the very significant pressure is the approach that the government has taken on asylum, granting refugee status faster, thereby people being pushed out of the doors of the Home Office asylum dispersal accommodation, and onto local housing waiting lists. And I'm sure many honourable members in this chamber will have been lobbied by their local authorities about the impact that that additional pressure, those additional people who are perfectly entitled under our laws to access that housing is having on the supply that is available in their local areas. So all of these things have a huge collective impact on the pool of available housing. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, as we've seen in recent news, the declining confidence abroad in our economy is reducing the number of overseas students, which means it's more important than ever to support thriving student accommodations through tenancies that address student needs properly. And especially, Madam Deputy Speaker, especially for those students who may be older, who have families already, who are studying for higher degrees where they have a fixed commitment to a particular location. All of those different requirements need to be addressed effectively in this legislation. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, does this bill rise in its new form to these challenges? It's very clear that it does fail to ensure that landlords can recover their property quickly when they need to, which reduces incentives for those to rent it out, especially for small landlords. If the member for Hampstead and Kilburn needs to recover some of her property portfolio to return it to another owner, will she have the assurance under this bill that she has due process available to her? It fails to ensure the flexibility and the freedom of contract so that tenants and landlords can agree a deal which suits them both. Students wanting to book accommodation for a 2-year period, guaranteed or shorter or longer, those who may be moving for a fixed-term work contract to a new location, all requiring opportunities and flexibility that are taken away by this legislation. It takes away the opportunity for landlords to make allowances for financially riskier tenants, such as those with a poor credit record, through rent in advance or other safeguarding arrangements to ensure that the landlord has confidence that they will not lose out, and that locks those financially vulnerable people out of the rental market. It creates enormous obligations on local councils, one of the biggest additional sets of burdens and expectations in generations, but as yet no real clarity about how that will be resourced at a point when all of those wider uncertainties add up to a great deal of additional cost. And it fails to provide the necessary assurance that those tenants who have pets and who need to access insurance as part of their tenancy conditions will be able to find that in a way that is available and affordable, as we set out in our new Clause 21. But more concerning still, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a missed opportunity to provide this House and all the members who are gathered here to debate it with a proper impact assessment or the assurance of a future review, so that we have really good evidence on which to base our decisions. Our new Clause 20 sets out means of addressing that shortcoming, and the House will have the opportunity to vote for it shortly. And an example of where there is significant uncertainty, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard in some of the political knockabout the government seeking to blame its predecessor for court delays, while simultaneously claiming that there are no delays worthy of regard in the passage of this bill, while it loads more regulation onto the sector. Now, both of those things cannot be simultaneously true. So let us ensure that we properly assess the impact before we legislate. There is a lot of goodwill, for example, the point about tenants with pets being able to access the accommodation that they need. We do not want to find ourselves in this House returning to this issue because this legislation has failed to achieve what we hoped it would achieve. Now, clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is the role of this chamber to scrutinise and to question. And it is the role of the opposition to oppose when we cannot see that the legislation before us will result in an improvement in the lot of the people of this country. There is a pattern emerging, Madam Deputy Speaker. They came after the farmers, they came after the pubs, they came after the small businesses, they came after the private schools, they came after our local councillors. And now this bill, in its new form, comes after our tenants and our landlords. And it's very clear by the number of government amendments which the Minister referred to in his introduction that the points we made in committee, that this bill has many shortcomings that need to be addressed, are not lost on the government. And I return to the point, Madam Deputy Speaker. Even a Labour council, a bastion like Lambeth, led by the Labour chair of London councils, is rushing to use Section 21 to evict its own tenants in advance of this bill because of the impact that it will have. A Labour council and a Labour government putting their own people out of their homes. Now, I know that the Minister is no Corbynista. We certainly learnt that in the debate. In fact, I even discovered that he has named his dog after Clement Attlee, who I assume is a great political hero. But the government's own amendments, 13 and 14, make this bill so much worse for prospective tenants. Many of us will have had constituents come to our surgeries in situations where perhaps they're turning their life around. They've got a job, they've got an income, they've got some savings, but they haven't got a good credit record. And they face being locked out of the housing market, because the necessary flexibilities and measures that would address that credit score concern are effectively prohibited.
Absolutely.
For people who are foreign workers coming to the UK, needing to access accommodation and provide sufficient guarantees, foreign students, people who retire looking to downsize to a rental property, people who for family reasons can't access a guarantor, all of those people find themselves significantly disadvantaged by those amendments 13 and 14, which increase the risk to landlords by taking away the mitigations, and they take away the freedom of people to reach a contract and an agreement that suits them both. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I know the party opposite are very keen on asking this side for apologies, so I'm going to conclude with one. To all those, I promised the honourable member that's exactly what I'm going to do. To all those in the private rented sector, I'm going to make an apology. 82%, the Minister from a secondary position said, I only have 4 hours. Well, I won't be able to go through all the private tenants individually, I'm afraid. However, the apology will be fulsome. It's to those in the private rented sector, 82% of whom say they are very satisfied with their accommodation. I'm sorry that you're going to be faced with the mess that this bill is creating. Whether you are seeking to rent your first home,
absolutely right,
or whether you are someone who needs to move to a new one. I won't give way because I'm concluding. We on this side will give you the undertaking that whilst you may have to endure it to the next election, this side will put it right for the benefits of landlords and tenants alike.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his constructive work with the Liberal Democrats and other parties in the committee stage of the bill. For a generation cut off from the dream of home ownership, we find that after a century of flogging off social houses and council houses, over 1.5 million lost since 1980, that there are now basically none left. It's vital that we restore hope to millions to aspire to a decent home. And so Liberal Democrats support the key principle of this bill, which is to bring an end to no-fault evictions. Giving tenants the security they deserve after the continual stop-start of the previous government is long overdue. It's time to end the fear once and for all that any complaint from any tenant could be met with an instant eviction notice at any moment. Of course, landlords don't generally act in such a cavalier fashion. Most are good landlords. We value them and what they bring to the market. So to sustain a healthy private renter sector, we've tabled Amendment 10, which would extend to off-street student rental landlords the same possession rules that apply to purpose-built student accommodation. Given that fully 31% on the Accommodation for Students website are 1 or 2 bedroom properties, not HMOs, as Unipol and Higher Education Policy Unit pointed out. It's a big chunk and needs to be addressed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The need for more homes is also why we've tabled Amendment 2, which would particularly incentivise more build-to-rent accommodation. In Taunton and Wellington, our Live Down councillor supported delivery of tens of thousands of new homes. Our population's increased 10% up to 2021. And our manifesto called for 150,000 social homes per year. And I refer the House to my register of interest as a social experience as a social landlord. We clearly set out the borrowing of £6 billion per year that would make that happen, unlike the Labour and Conservative manifestos, which included no numbers whatsoever for social housing. But we need a lot of that build-to-rent accommodation to also be rent-to-own, so that renters can accrue ownership of their own home. It's time to give a whole generation of young people that have been excluded that elusive step on the housing ladder. Amendment 2 would therefore give a developer of build-to-rent housing the security of a fixed term for the first 24 months. Now, since that was tabled, I've heard from the British Property Federation and others that they would suggest a 6-month fixed term. The initial fixed term that would enable them to secure the investment they need to build more and to get building. It wouldn't undermine the general principle of moving to periodic tenancies. Build-to-rent is only 0.1% of the housing stock. We won't press Amendment 2 further, but I genuinely urge the government to take up the idea, run with it, and generate more investment in new homes. Turning to the interest of tenants, so overlooked for so long. My constituent and friend Mike Gortliman, who died while recovering from major surgery while under the threat of a no-fault eviction notice for no reason he could possibly work out, was disabled. And in part, in his memory, our new clause 23 would ensure that landlords of both private and social tenancies must give permission for home adaptations when a home assessment has been carried out. And because if rental bidding is to be outlawed, as the Minister said, it mustn't be replaced with bidding up rent in advance, our new clause 1 would limit that rent in advance to 2 months' rent. And I welcome new clause 13 from the government in respect of that. In-tenancy rent increases also need to be limited to protect tenants from exorbitant increases. The most sensible way to do this is set out in our Amendment 1, which would peg increases to the Bank of England base rate. Property is a financial investment asset. Landlords' costs are directly influenced by mortgage rates rather than by general inflation and cost of living. Our new clause 22, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for St Albans, would require landlords to pay for alternative accommodation when dwellings are unfit for human habitation. Turning to amendments proposed by other honourable members, we support the proposed new clause 10 in the name of the honourable member for Dulwich and West Norwood, which would prevent a guarantor from being liable on the death of a tenant, and recognising the government has tabled an amendment to limit this liability rather than end it altogether. We also support Amendment 7 on the content that must be submitted for inclusion on the database. The database could be a very powerful instrument for tenants if it provides information, as I spoke at some length in the committee. And new clause 6, which would give care leavers support through funding for a deposit when they move out of care, both in the name of the honourable member for Liverpool Wavertree. One of the biggest concerns to landlords, tenants, and local communities in Taunton, Wellington, Cornwall, the Lakes, other places, is that there's no control over the number of homes being turned into holiday lets and Airbnbs. It's prompted a significant increase, about 3,000 holiday homes in Somerset now, a 33% increase in short-term rentals in the South West since 2019. Visitors, of course, bring welcome investment, but in some areas, second homes are pricing locals out of local markets.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Certainly.
Thank you. Thank you for giving way. You talk about second homes, and in particular, they can affect rural communities. And within the bill, under Schedule 5, there are mandatory grounds to recover possession to house someone who's an agricultural worker. But would you agree, as my honourable friend, that the definition of agricultural worker is limited and actually doesn't reflect rural workers? So, for example, those who work in the horse training industry, like those in the village of Lambourne in my constituency, where local housing is key to that industry, given the nature and the hours of the work of stable staff.
My honourable friend, the member for Newbury, is absolutely right, and the definition of agricultural workers needs to cover the breadth of agricultural workers. I'm sure the Minister has heard the point that he's made. Liberal Democrats have long argued, therefore, on second homes for a licensing system and tougher planning controls, a new use class to cover second homes and short-term lets. Both this and the last government said they would create a new use class. So please can I urge the Minister in the debate today to go further and say whether that will really happen. Without controls, there's a serious risk that second homes could proliferate if, following this bill, landlords don't wish to be part of a more regulated private rented sector. Our new clause 2, therefore, would require government to properly assess the growth in short-term lets, and I urge the Minister to do so. In fact, I'm not sure why anyone would oppose that amendment. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, our Amendment 3 would apply the bill's proposed decent home standard to military service family accommodation. And I'm grateful to the Minister for taking the time to write to me on this, but the argument that the standard would not be suitable to service family accommodation doesn't stand up, because Clause 98 of the bill allows the Secretary of State to establish whatever version of decent home standard they feel is appropriate. Though why that should be any different for service families, I don't think anyone across the House would understand. We will hear, no doubt, the MOD say that 90% or more of service family accommodation already meets the decent home standards, so it's all okay. In which case, why not make that claim evidenced by subjecting that accommodation to the decent home standard in the bill? To say that the recently published Select Committee Service Accommodation Report under the chairmanship of the Honourable Member for Slough says different from the official reports would be a massive understatement. The Select Committee reported evidence from one service family that said, "It is impossible to challenge the decent home standard without paying for a survey yourself. It's widely accepted that each house has not been checked, but either guessed at, or it's assumed that the standard of one house is the same as all in one area. I ask, therefore, how sure can we be of the self-declared statistics from the DIO, or were they from Annington Homes? As another witness to the Select Committee said, it's disingenuous for the DIO to present glossy brochures about being Decent Homes Plus when they clearly are anything but. It is clear the DIO's property frequently does not meet the standards. They added, crucially, moreover, there is no local authority or anyone else to hold them to account, as would be the case with private and other local landlords. That is exactly what Amendment 3 would do, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yeah. In the Kerslake report commissioned before the election by the now Secretary of State for Defence and former Housing Minister, Right Honourable Member for Rawmarsh and Conisbrough, reports of damp, mould and other service accommodation, rat infestations abound. So if all the witnesses are wrong, if all these reports are wrong, and the official figures are right that over 90% do meet the Decent Home Standard, then there's nothing for the MOD to fear, Madam Deputy Speaker, in subjecting to that assessment, just as social and private landlords will have to do under this bill. The hard work of my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire in the last Parliament, even got the last government to come round to the idea. The then Minister, the former member for Redcar, said in this chamber on the 24th of April last year that the government intend to ensure service accommodation meets the Decent Home Standard. Service families such as 40 Commando Royal Marines, part of our Taunton and Wellington family community, make massive sacrifices for our country. Sometimes they make the ultimate sacrifice, Madam Deputy Speaker. They deserve decent homes, and the MOD should be required to meet the standard just as the government is requiring that of other landlords. I'm grateful to see support for this amendment from across the House. That's why we're tabling Amendment 3. That's what we'll be voting for this evening, to support our service families, and I urge members across the House to vote for it too.
Yeah. Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshamurley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by paying tribute to members from across the House who've tabled amendments to this at this stage, and to the Minister who's engaged constructively with members between second reading and report stage. And Madam Deputy Speaker, as we debate this bill today, I think it's important for us to remember why it's so badly needed. And that's because of the dire situation that many tenants across all our constituencies are facing across the UK through no fault of their own. Yeah. We have to ask ourselves, how did we get to a position where tenants have the threat of eviction held over their head for no good reason? How did we get to a position where tenants can be given only a couple of months to raise thousands of pounds for rent in advance on top of the moving costs and deposits? How did we get to a position where the average rent rise went up by 9.1% last year? And I think it's fair to say for far too long, tenants have been an innocent victim of an unjust power balance in the rental market. And as a result of this, many of them have been unable to keep a roof over their head, and they sadly fall into homelessness. This cannot continue any longer, and we need a fairer deal for renters. I'll give way to the Honourable.
We noticed an increase in the number of threatened evictions coming at the present time, no-fault evictions, excessive rent rises and harassment by landlords of private sector tenants. And does she believe there's any immediate and urgent protection that we can give to those tenants?
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention, and as a fellow London MP, he'll see what I see in my inbox in terms of many tenants facing that threat on an almost daily basis. The same tenants who come to our advice surgeries, the same tenants who are turned away from overstretched council departments, the same tenants who cannot apply to the social housing waiting list because those lists are already full. And it's really important we get those guarantees and protections for those tenants as outlined in this bill to hopefully help my constituents and his constituents up and down the country. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this situation cannot continue any longer, which is why I'm proud that the bill introduced by the government will strengthen some of the amendments, and I welcome the amendments and suggestions put forward by members. I want to extend my support to the amendments put forward by the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, by the government on limiting rent payment in advance. Now, this is a big issue for my constituents in Vauxhall and Campbell Green. I've spoken to so many tenants being asked to stump up 6 months to 12 months rent in advance. This leaves many people priced out of the rental market, ending in a race to the bottom where landlords can charge more and more for less in return. We've got to ask ourselves, how can you finally find a place that you want to call home, only be told that you need to pay up, that's thousands of pounds up front? And I've mentioned, in some cases, because of the rents being charged in my constituency and many others, the money that people have been asked to stump up in advance amounts to a deposit if they took that money to another part of the country to purchase a home. We are talking in excess of £30,000 if you calculated someone being asked to stump up the average rent of £2,500 per calendar month in my constituency. The result is that those who do not have significant savings or family wealth need to end up borrowing just to call somewhere to live. This cycle of exploitation is pushing thousands of people into debt and impacting them for the rest of their lives. Research from Step Change shows that 1 in 6 private renters are relying on credit to make ends meet. Something must change. This system is really broken. And we must lower immediate financial pressures on tenants and make private renting fairer for everyone, which is why I welcome the amendments tabled in the name of the Secretary of State, and I urge the House to support the measures which will reduce upfront costs for all renters. My constituency is also home to thousands of university students from great universities across London. Students often have the most insecure housing because landlords know that they can charge a new group higher rents every year. So again, I welcome the measures restricting the time that a landlord can agree new tenancy prior to the end of the current tenancy in student housing. I think many of us will remember that time when you signed up to university, looking at your accommodation, you sign up to live with some of your friends, some that you've known, and maybe by Christmas you've all fallen out. Or that frantic search of when someone leaves the property and you've got to find a replacement, a new flatmate. The many very social media posts that you're putting, spareroom.com, Facebook. And you know, students in university need that time to be able to bed into their new accommodation. This amendment will help give those students that breathing space and to avoid the very problems that they are facing when they are signing up for early start-up accommodation. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to mention a vitally important issue raised in new Clause 10, and I pay tribute to my constituency neighbour, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, for tabling this and her tireless campaign on this really important issue. The death of a loved one is a difficult and challenging time for anybody. And the one thing that people need is that time and space to grieve. Yet under the current rule, guarantors can end up facing a huge bill for the remainder of the loved one's rent. None of us would want to place in that situation. It is right that the government has acted to prevent guarantors from being faced with this unacceptable scenario, and I urge the House to support this amendment. I'd also like to briefly touch on some of the other amendments tabled by other members today, which I hope that the government will look at during a passage in the other place. Firstly, while the bill does introduce a rent tribunal for unfair rent rises, there is some concern from groups like Renters Reform Coalition that the current measures in the bill do not go far enough to prevent landlords evicting a tenant under the guise of a large rent increase. I'm particularly concerned that using market rents may not be an appropriate benchmark when market data is poor. Renters at the bottom end of the market could end up being told that an unaffordable rent rise is acceptable under this system. We need guarantees that the use of tribunal resolves this and is actually available and accessible to tenants. In Scotland, only a handful of the rent increase cases a year go through the tribunal system to the rent officer. It would severely undermine this bill should tenants being exploited not take up the option available to them. So I'd be grateful if the ministers could explain how the government will encourage the take-up of this provision, and if he'll support the alternative measures and safeguards in this bill, such as the Amendment 9 tabled by the member for Liverpool Wavertree. Finally, a number of amendments have touched on the vital issue of home adaptations in the private rented sector. It's not fair that disabled tenants end up with reduced access to their own homes. The government is rightly looking at making it easier for disabled people to thrive in the workplace. But what's the point of thriving if you don't even have adequate home and adequate housing? You cannot expect someone to go out and work and contribute to the economy if they haven't had a good night's sleep. Can any of us imagine being unable to have a shower in your own flat because the landlord refuses to make the necessary adaptations. Or trying to cook in a kitchen, but you can't even reach the worktops. None of us would want to live in those conditions, yet this is the reality for many disabled people in the private rented sector right now in 2025 in the UK. They face this on a daily basis, seeing more challenges and blockages trying to get private landlords to address this. So I urge the government to ensure that disabled people do not face a private rented sector that is far too completely inaccessible to them. I look forward to the government responding to my predecessor committee's report on disabled people in the housing sector. And we must continue as a House to look at how we fight for a rental sector that works for everybody, regardless of your background. Thank you.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm privileged to be able to serve as a member of the Bill Committee, and it's good to see many of the fellow committee members in the House this afternoon. And I think as I start, I want to just pay tribute to the many excellent landlords that do exist around our country. I appreciate that this piece of legislation is being designed to tackle the worst offenders, but it's worth just putting on record that there are thousands and thousands who do a good job of providing long-term accommodation for many people in the private rented sector. We've spoken before, though, in the passage of this bill, both in the second reading and also throughout the committee stage, of the unintended consequences that are existing within it, and some still remain, and that has been alluded to by my colleague on the front bench this afternoon.
Will my honourable friend
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I think you raised a really important point on unintended consequences, and one of my concerns is that it's really important that we consider our key workers, so our NHS staff and our police, who rely on accommodation that is tied to their employment. With the abolition of assured short-hold tenancies, it's really important that we ensure the provisions are there in order to support those tenancies so that they can continue, so that we can retain and attract much-needed police officers and NHS staff. Would my honourable friend agree with me on that front?
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and I absolutely agree with her. And again, that's a perfect example of one of the unintended consequences, which I don't believe have been put in deliberately, but are just one of those things that as a result of this legislation we may well see. The other things are those who are accidental landlords, those who didn't intend to be landlords and are not large portfolio holders, particularly small landlords. And we've already heard from my honourable friend about the challenge that they have for economic drivers, and also the risk of the market shrinking. I know we talked a lot about that in the second reading, but ultimately we are seeing landlords leaving the market. And as I've said before, you know, if there are fewer homes for those people to rent, we are kind of in a worse situation. And that's why I support this afternoon new clause 20 in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. I believe that the review of the impact of the Act on the housing market after a year is really important to just make sure that we can make it even better, the bill even better than it is already, because I believe it is important to address those unintended consequences. I think we could all agree across this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that that's important given the challenges we've already heard about this afternoon about high housing lists and homelessness that is rife across our country. And it's also important to listen to landlords. So in particular, I want to just draw attention to some of the reasons why I think this new clause is so important. Plymouth Access to Housing, or known as PATH, are a key player in tackling homelessness in my constituency, and they work especially with those who are harder to place into accommodation. Now, they have rightly said that they support the bill in principle, and as we've heard today, large parts of it my side would be supporting too, but they say they support it in a buoyant private rented market, and so their concerns are because at the moment what they see is that the private rented market is not buoyant and that there is already a challenge, and so they are concerned in that respect, hence why a review would be important. They also say that they have, though, received funding in the past to support landlords to stay in the private rented sector. And I would be interested in what plans the Minister might have, perhaps outside of the process of this bill, to ensure that those organisations, some of whom have been worked in the past by honourable members in the room today, might be able to mitigate the impacts of some of those the challenges that might be faced in future. The South West Landlords Association, who I've also mentioned in this place today, would benefit from new clause 20 because it would allow for the assessment of what would essentially amount to a doubling of the amount of rent arrears that can be accrued and the notice required for possession before they as landlords are able to get somebody out of their property. And they're particularly concerned about that for the financial reasons that we've already set out. If you have to wait for 3 months of arrears and then another month's notice before you can remove somebody from your property where they've not been paying that rent, again, for those small landlords and those accidental landlords in particular, that's a massive impact. That's nearly half a year of income that they would lose. And ultimately, it's the luck of the draw, isn't it, Madam Deputy Speaker? We don't know in advance how good the tenants are going to be. So if you have an excellent tenant, it's not a problem, but with a bad tenant, it's not so good.
My honourable friend, give way.
Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She's making a powerful speech. Does she agree with me? The only way fundamentally to secure the rights of tenants is to ensure that buoyant rental market that she's talking about, that landlords want to enter, want to invest in, because then they will be competing with tenants, and the market, which is the biggest and most powerful force of all, will drive decent behaviour towards tenants, because without it, landlords won't be able to gain and retain them.
So I appreciate the point that my honourable friend is making, and I do agree that the market is really important. However, I also appreciate that there are those where the market has failed them. So I think we have got to find a situation where those who are not looked after by their landlords are able to receive support. However, as I've already said, my concerns are that this bill goes too far in the opposite direction, and many good landlords who are there to drive through this market
My honourable
are...
friend, give way again.
Sure.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. And I would say, with the freedom on the back benches, I think the last Conservative government got this wrong. And when they stopped landlords being able to offset the interest payments on the mortgage for that commercial asset against their income, it was one step among many which actually reduced the number of landlords coming into the market. And each step along the way, instead of seeking to strengthen the market, successive governments, as Conservative and now, of course, it's bound to be completed by Labour, move against landlords to make it a less and less investable asset. And the only people ultimately who lose out most are tenants.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that ultimately tenants are at risk of losing out if there are no properties left in the market. And that leads me on to my next point, and one of the other reasons why an assessment would be useful in the light of New Clause 20, because we heard during the Bill Committee stage that rural landlords are particularly concerned. We know that 44% of landlords, according to the CLA, are planning to sell in the next 2 years, and only 21 of them are planning to build new properties. So when 90% of those planning to leave cite reforms to the private rented sector as a reason, we definitely do need that opportunity to reflect on this and to see what that impact assessment is going to be. I just want to briefly turn, though, having just set out some of my reasons for supporting New Clause 20, to New Clause 15, which has been mentioned many times this afternoon already, and I appreciate absolutely why it has been tabled in those tragic circumstances that have been laid out. However, in light of some conversation we had in the Bill Committee, I'm interested to see who is in scope to be considered family for the purpose of that guarantor system. It lists out child, grandchild, parent, grandparent, sibling, niece or nephew, aunt or uncle or cousin. A wide, but I think we would all agree, highly realistic view of what family is. However, in Schedule 1 of the bill, when it comes to those who a landlord may be able to house and as a result evict an existing tenant, a landlord is only allowed to do that for a parent, grandparent, sibling, child and grandchild. Now, I raised this with the Minister during the bill, and I know that he thinks that tenants' rights would be hindered if we were to extend that definition of family. However, I do find it puzzling that a very wide extended family is justified in New Clause 15, but not in the determination of who lives in a property, because often those family members may well be vulnerable themselves and needing somewhere to live. So I know it's a niche point, but for the government to say you can't house your niece and nephew, or indeed in the light of New Clause 15, your aunt, uncle or cousin, feels like an overreach of the state. And I think we are slightly testing ownership rights and restricting trust and freedom in society as a result. And just briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you will allow me, I am not a big fan, I have to say, of Amendment 7, where it lists out some very excessive details of what has to be provided in a landlord's register, in particular the name and address of the landlord. I think we all know how worried we are about our name and address being in the public domain, and I think to be expecting landlords who are ultimately business people to do the same is one step too far. I also think we need to look at essentially when their conviction for being a bad landlord is spent, because if they are kind of reformed at some point, I think we've got to give them the opportunity to be able to show that and ultimately provide homes as a result. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, new clause 6, I'd like to just speak in support of the Honourable Member for Wavertree's amendment, particularly around looked after children, and this came up last week in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, and I spoke to it. I think we absolutely need to be doing more to ensure that as corporate parents, which ultimately every single local authority is, we act like parents and that wider family. And if that young person needs a deposit or needs some rent guarantee to enable them to get into the private rented sector when other options for housing are not available, that we should absolutely be looking at that. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be voted on this afternoon or not, but in principle, the Honourable Lady has my support, and I hope we might be able to work together on that in the future. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I call Michael Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was very pleased to serve on the Public Bill Committee for this particular piece of legislation. A piece of legislation that I believe is a concrete example of the positive difference this Labour government is making to people's lives. I fundamentally believe that everyone should have somewhere that they can call home, and that they should feel secure in that home. This bill's provisions will deliver massive improvements for the millions of tenants in the private rented sector. Tenants who for too long have been forced to pay over the odds for housing that is often inadequate and insecure. It finally addresses the clear imbalance of power that exists between landlords and tenants, levelling the playing field by delivering a once-in-a-generation boost to tenants' rights, moving away from expensive, precarious, poor-quality accommodation and ending a status quo that has left tenants under the constant threat of losing their home. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the Bill Committee, we heard evidence regarding the issues of landlords demanding multiple months' worth of rent up front at the start of a tenancy. This is a highly exclusionary practice that shuts lower-income renters out of the market, requiring them to hand over thousands of pounds on top of their deposit at the start of a tenancy. The spread of this practice would have a devastating impact on the choices available to many tenants, and I therefore warmly welcome new clauses 13 and 14 in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Ashton-under-Lyne, which I believe address this issue. But Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to Section 21 evictions. One of the absolute privileges of being an MP is going to visit local schools and answer questions from pupils. These questions can be anything, but normally relate to the interests and experiences of the children. What can you do about the traffic? How can you make my park and playground better? And even, and this is a real one, I really like trees. Do you like trees? But on a recent visit to St Andrew's Primary School in Eccles, I was given a poignant reminder of why we're here and why this bill is so important. One of the pupils asked me, "What are you doing to stop people being kicked out of their homes for no reason?" It is a shocking question to hear from someone so young, and it serves as an appalling illustration of how wide the fear of no-fault evictions is. No child should even know what a Section 21 eviction is, and no child should live in fear of losing their home. We cannot allow these evictions to continue, and for me this is the most critical part of this bill. It is beyond time to end the spectre of homelessness that hangs over these tenants, to end Section 21 evictions, giving people a steady, strong, secure foundation to build their lives around. Unfortunately, no-fault evictions are just one of the many challenges facing tenants. Action to tackle unaffordable rents is badly needed, which is why the measures in this bill to end rental bidding wars and stop the use of unreasonable rent increases designed to drive out tenants are so important. Never-ending rent increases are bad for tenants, and they are bad for the economy, absorbing money that could be spent more productively elsewhere. I also welcome the measures in the bill to drive up standards across the sector, such as the application of the Decent Home Standard and the establishment of a private rented sector database. All of these reforms are entirely necessary in a market where year after year tenants are expected to pay more for less. It is hard to overstate the impact that housing has on people's lives, or the detrimental effects caused by the sector's current flaws. This bill's reforms decisively rebalance a broken sector, ending the scandal of no-fault evictions and encouraging the market to provide affordable, high-quality accommodation with security of tenure. This bill represents real and meaningful action we all should welcome.
Yeah. Will Forster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of us are described as either a dog person or a cat person. I've had my dog for over 5 years now, and that definitely means I now feel like a dog person as a result. Joking aside, it's quite clear that we as a country are in love with our pets. So many of us are defined by them. But the laws that govern us should reflect how we live and how we choose to live. And actually, our lack of respect for people's homes and our lack of respect for the ability to bring a pet into our home is shocking, and that's why I'm pleased with this bill. Sadly, there are gaps for pet owners in the rental market, particularly. These gaps not only create an uneven playing field for people choosing new homes, but they fill animal shelters with much-loved pets that should be in their stable homes. Many of these pets are in those animal shelters because of unfair rules by landlords that have been introduced for years. According to research conducted by the Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, only 8% of private landlords actually list their property as pet-friendly. 8%. But I don't want to just talk about statistics. The numbers have real-life consequences for families and animals. In my constituency of Woking, I've got a constituent, a woman along with her family, was evicted after 16 years of a tenancy because the landlord decided to sell the property. The council tried to find alternative housing for the family, but repeatedly came up against obstacles, including a no pets policy. This policy would have forced the family to give up their 3 cats, including one that her autistic son is emotionally bonded to. It's their emotional support pet. A letter from the GP stated how important this was to this child's well-being. But despite that, it didn't help. It also, this cat reduced her son's anxiety levels and helped him with his day-to-day functioning. It had a huge impact, but the housing officers noted we could have considered her for a place in some new flats that the council built, but the housing provider doesn't accept pets. The family has 3 cats. This case is not unique, sadly. It perfectly illustrates the emotional toll that the rules can have on families, particularly those with additional needs. Pet ownership might seem like a small issue in face of the homelessness and eviction and the heart-wrenching issues we've already heard today. But it's quite clear that sometimes this happens directly because there are no protections for families with pets and people are forced into a horrible situation. It's fair to say the culture of a country should be reflected in the laws that govern it. Most of us have pets. Let's ensure that we are allowed to keep them. I'm really pleased to hear my honourable friend, the member for Taunton, pursue my party's amendments, and I'm pleased that my Select Committee Chair, the Honourable Lady for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, together, cross-party, I think there's been a lot of welcome support for this bill, but pushing the government to go further still. And as much as I'm supportive of this bill could be better. It could help reduce our casework going forward of heart-wrenching stories of vulnerable tenants pushed out and treated badly by landlords. This will help us, Madam Deputy Speaker, but with the amendments that have been tabled, and I know there are other amendments going to be proposed in the other place, this bill should be better. Thank you.
Bel Ribeiro Addy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to declare an interest in this debate. Like 1 in 3 households in my constituency of Clapham and Brixton Hill, I rent my home. And so, as a renter and an MP who represents a large number of renters, it will come as no surprise that I rise to speak in favour of this legislation, which will bring some important long overdue reforms to provide private renters with decent and secure homes. Crucially, I'm pleased to see the abolition of Section 21 evictions, something that was promised by the party opposite, including in their 2019 manifesto, but they never delivered. Close to 1 million people faced no-fault evictions notices in the last Parliament because of their failure, adding to the homelessness crisis we now face. I'm also happy to see measures in this bill that focus on affordability. In my borough of Lambeth, renting a one-bedroom home now costs the average person more than half of their take-home pay. When teachers, rail staff, nurses and other key workers went on strike to call for inflation-matching pay rises, the last government attacked them, called them greedy and rejected their demands. But they shrugged their shoulders as private landlords collected above-inflation rent hikes from some of these same key workers year after year. In recent years, the situation has been particularly pronounced. In March 2024, the ONS reported that monthly rents rose by 9.1%, the highest annual increase recorded since records began in 2015. So I'm glad that this legislation brings some common sense to the situation, ensuring that rent increases can no longer be written into contracts, that landlords will only be able to legally increase rents once a year, and actually protecting tenants from the egregious rent hikes. Also highly positive are the new measures to strengthen enforcement against slum private landlords, extending the decent home standard to the private rental sector and widening council enforcement powers, as well as extending the range of financial penalties available to local authorities to fund enforcement activity. Finally, I'm pleased that this bill legislates for a consultation on improving energy standards in rented homes. The UK has some of the most energy inefficient homes in Europe, with 2.6 million private rented homes falling below minimum energy efficiency standards in England and Wales alone. Almost a quarter of renters live in fuel poverty, the highest rate of any tenure. Now, this bill contains important measures to provide renters with some of the basic security and place some basic responsibility on landlords. However, there is so much more that can be done to strengthen this bill. I'm pleased to see that the government is supporting amendments from my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, and I'm pleased to be supporting amendments 9, 5 and 6 from my honourable friend, the member for Liverpool Wavertree, which should better protect sitting tenants from unaffordable rent increases. In its current form, the legislation only caps rent increases at market rate, i.e. The prices landlords set. These amendments would instead cap these at CPI or wage growth, whichever is the lowest. Because I'm yet to hear a compelling reason why landlords should see their incomes grow faster than people who actually work for a living. I would also like to place on record my support for the Renters Reform Coalition in their call for a National Rental Affordability Commission to investigate methods to bring down rents relative to incomes. I know there aren't very many members opposite, but in their speeches that they have made, I've heard about homes being talked about almost entirely as assets, forgetting that they are actually homes that people need to live in. So I welcome those amendments that actually remember that people are living in these homes and people have a variety of different circumstances and they should be viewed with compassion. So I welcome and support the amendment, new clause 10, which was put forward by my honourable friend and constituency neighbour, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, as well as the new clause 9 by the member for Bristol Central on adaptations for disabled people. It's also welcome overall the legislation would make it illegal to discriminate against benefit claimants and families for exactly the same reason. I'd like to see further changes to prevent discrimination, like scrapping right to rent checks and reforming the laws around guarantors more generally. I would like to see the legislation go further on preventing illegal evictions and backdoor evictions too. As the London Renters Union has pointed out, for the many families struggling with housing costs, a 20% rent hike is simply a no-fault eviction under a different name. During my time as an MP, I've seen too many unscrupulous attempts to remove tenants to be unconcerned about a likely increase in illegal evictions as one response to scrapping Section 21. And whilst I welcome new enforcement powers, we have to acknowledge that the financial difficulties that have faced local authorities after 14 years of massive cuts. It's essential that the government ensures local authorities have the resources they need to actually use these enforcement powers. And finally, when it comes to disrepair, Madam Deputy Speaker, tenants should have the right to withhold rent when repairs are not being carried out within appropriate timescales. This happens far too often. Too many renters are paying for a shoddy service and living in awful conditions. Too many renters, young people in particular, face a despairing future of potentially spending a lifetime as private renters and are left living in these dire conditions of extreme disrepair and continue to have to pay their full rental amount each month lest they face eviction. They should have the right to withhold rent in these circumstances, and this bill is the prime place to ensure that. This would support the bill's stated intention of ensuring the decent home standards applies to the private rented sector. And renters more generally have been neglected right across different pieces of legislation we've passed over the years. And if this landmark bill is truly going to reform the rental sector and shift the balance of power to create a more equal relationship between renters and landlords, then I believe that more needs to be done, and I urge the government to adopt these amendments. Thank you.
Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I broadly welcome this bill and the strengthened protections it will provide to private tenants. And I'd like to associate myself with the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Taunton Wellington, and the amendments which he and my honourable friend, the member for St Albans, have proposed. But I wish in my remarks to focus on one aspect of the bill and see if I can encourage some last-minute reconsideration by the Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government recently repurchased over 36,000 Ministry of Defence properties from the private sector. This move is a step in the right direction. Yet many of these properties, including those in my constituency of Bicester and Woodstock, have fallen into disrepair, have failed to be managed properly, and are now substandard or unsafe. Service personnel and their families, as other members have said, living in Ministry of Defence accommodation and in my constituency in Ambrosden and in Caversfield, have expressed frustration with the current management and maintenance companies. Liberal Democrats are clear that our service personnel and their families deserve the same decent standards that the government is proposing for the rest of the private rented sector. And I'm proud to join my honourable friend, the member for Taunton and Wellington, in supporting Amendment 3 today. Will the government now commit to using this legislation to ensure that the recently reacquired Ministry of Defence accommodation will be covered by the Decent Home Standard, so that those living in service family accommodation in my constituency are able to access safe, weathertight and warm accommodation? The Minister argued in response to my honourable friend, the member for Epsom and Ewell, that it would not be appropriate to extend the Decent Home Standard to service families accommodation. So can he therefore clarify, so that I can inform my constituents, whether they should expect to live in service family accommodation that meets that standard, and if they should, how and to whom they can appeal if this accommodation continues to fall below the standard?
Good question.
I'll happily give way.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and good afternoon. I'd like to just raise a concern actually around military accommodation. I have that in my constituency of Portsmouth North, and although there are concerns around it not being involved in this bill, one of the main concerns I have is the immense amount of funding cuts that have been given to that accommodation. So they are in such a state of disrepair that actually we as a government have had to go back and rebuy those properties to make sure they are aware. So will the honourable gentleman agree with me that actually this is a larger issue that we need to be dealing with when we're looking at things like the Armed Forces Commissioner role that's coming in?
I'd like to thank the honourable member for Portsmouth North for her comments, and I wholeheartedly agree. The state of the Ministry of Defence service family accommodation estate is in disrepair because of a significant lack of investment by the last government, which failed to maintain the standards that should be enjoyed by our hard-working and dedicated service personnel and their families. However, the fact that this government has made the welcome step to purchase that estate means it is now the obligation of that government to uphold the standards. And since we are today talking about a piece of legislation which is intended to set the standard that all renters should expect to see, including those who are paying that rent now to the Ministry of Defence for their accommodation, it seems to me very questionable that this government is resisting that opportunity to set that high standard for service personnel. Finally, in the notes to the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government emphasises that the concerns that led to Awab's law will now be extended to the private rented sector. Given how serious those concerns were, given the death that occurred as a result of a failure to maintain property in the social rented sector, can the Minister finally let me know how I can go back to my constituents who are tenants now of the Ministry of Defence and tell them that they will enjoy the same protection as other private renters from Awab's law?
Adam Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So, stability for 11 million renters and indeed 2.3 million landlords is necessary to build our better Britain. For the tenants enduring the least affordable, poorest quality housing, disregarded renters' rights have had a profound impact on people's lives. I believe Britain deserves more than dodgy landlords, backdoor evictions and dismal living standards. The British people deserve to feel secure in their own homes. Some of my constituents, Madam Deputy Speaker, are forced to live in terrible accommodation, facing damp and mould. This treatment is fundamentally unacceptable. I will give way. Yeah.
I thank him for giving way. The Defence Select Committee recently published a report that said that service accommodation was shocking. 2/3 of it required massive investment to bring it up to standard, and damp and mould were legion. He talks of dodgy landlords. Would he characterise the Minister of Defence as a dodgy landlord? Should we be bringing those homes up to the decent home standard as everyone else benefits from in the country if this bill goes through?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I think it's important to note that the Minister addressed in his opening remarks that, yes, there are issues in this space, but it goes beyond the scope of this bill. And I think these are conversations that we need to continue having moving forward. I think he raises a very important point. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, Conservative failure has led to more than 200,000 households with children forced to live in privately rented, damp and squalid homes. According to The Guardian recently, 31,000 children aged 4 and under were admitted to hospital from damp and mould-related issues, as we've just been discussing. I very strongly believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, this just simply cannot be allowed to continue. Shelter also found recently that a quarter of renters are afraid to ask their landlords for basic repairs in fear of being evicted, and that 26,000 households are at risk of being made homeless from these no-fault evictions that we've been discussing today. We need the change, and fast. The abolition of Section 21 will end these no-fault evictions for good, and that is a vital part of this legislation. This ensures peace of mind for tenants in their own homes, to which they devote a sizable portion of their income. Pressure on local authorities to provide temporary accommodation has become totally unsustainable. Crisis estimates that £2.2 billion